Was passiert, wenn zwei Männer ehrlich über das sprechen, was sie wirklich im Herzen bewegt? Es entsteht ein Gespräch über Männlichkeit jenseits von Rollenbildern, ein Raum für emotionale Tiefe und die Kraft der authentischen Begegnung.
A man who's truly at his core has a instinctive knowing, and instinctive is the word that I really want to highlight. It's a felt sense, it's an embodied sense of this is who I am.
So schön, dass du wieder da bist. Herzlich willkommen zu 1000 First Steps, deinem Podcast für das Größte in dir. Mein Name ist Jakob und es ist mir immer eine ganz besondere Freude, wenn ich dir Menschen im Podcast vorstellen kann, die ich bereits zu meinen Freunden und Herzensmenschen zähle. Menschen wie Alex Lehmann. Vor 2,5 Jahren haben wir uns in Bali kennengelernt, bei einem Tantra-Männer-Retreat, bei der Initiation Journey, war auch schon 2-3 Mal Thema hier im Podcast. Und das war eine dieser seltenen Verbindungen, die sich schon von Beginn an unglaublich ehrlich und vertrauensvoll angefühlt haben. Vielleicht kennst du das aus deinem eigenen Leben. Manche Menschen, man hat einfach das Gefühl, man kennt sie schon sehr, sehr lange. Und seitdem haben wir uns auch beide beruflich in eine sehr ähnliche Richtung entwickelt, haben uns sehr stark auf Männerarbeit konzentriert und uns dabei regelmäßig nicht nur am Laufenden gehalten, sondern uns auch immer wieder gegenseitig unterstützt. Vor allem bei den persönlichen Themen und Challenges, die einfach unweigerlich aufkommen, wenn man die Intention verfolgt, nicht nur ein guter Mann, unter Anführungszeichen, zu sein, sondern tatsächlich gut darin zu werden, ein Mann zu sein. Und zwar nach den eigenen, authentischen Maßstäben, Vorstellungen und Werten. Und was das genau bedeutet, was es bedeuten kann, was es vor allen Dingen für dich bedeuten kann und welche ganz konkreten Schritte dabei helfen, darum geht es im heutigen Interview. Wir tauchen tief ein, fordern uns gegenseitig heraus und antworten ehrlich. Alex Lehmann ist Männercoach mit besonderem Fokus auf Beziehungen, außerdem Breathwork Facilitator und Gastgeber des sehr empfehlenswerten Podcasts Heart of Man. Hör da unbedingt mal rein, wirklich eine Herzensempfehlung. Es erwarten dich mittlerweile 47 Episoden mit Interviews rund um Beziehung, Sexualität, Leadership und mehr. Definitiv nicht nur für Männer interessant. Auch ich durfte bei Alex bereits zu Gast sein und ich stelle dir alle Links einfach in die Shownotes, dann hast du dort eine Übersicht. Dieses Gespräch heute mit Alex Lehmann ist für dich, wenn du dich auf den Weg gemacht hast, um mehr bei dir selbst anzukommen. Egal, ob du in einem männlichen oder in einem weiblichen Körper wohnst. Wir unterhalten uns über Demut, über Neugierde und das Studium des Lebens. Alex nimmt uns dabei mit auf seine eigene Reise. Von der Anpassung zur Aufrichtigkeit, vom Machen zum Spüren, vom Perfektionismus zur Präsenz. Wir sprechen über Beziehungen, über Angst, über Scham, ungeschminkt. Ja. Und über die Kraft, mit dem, was ist, präsent zu sein. Immer wieder sprechen wir auch über unsere persönlichen Challenges, nicht nur die gelösten und integrierten der Vergangenheit, es ist immer leicht darüber zu sprechen, sondern auch über die, die uns aktuell immer noch fordern und fördern. Ich spreche mit Alex auch über den Weg zurück zu uns selbst, zu unserer inneren Wahrheit, zur gelebten Männlichkeit jenseits von Schubladen, Konzepten und patriarchal geprägten Rollenbildern, jenseits von Härte und Selbstoptimierung. Ich glaube, dafür haben wir alle mittlerweile mehr als genug. Wir tauchen ein in verschiedene Sichtweisen von Männlichkeit, in die Bedeutung von männlichen und weiblichen Polaritäten, in Beziehungen, und in einen Schutzmechanismus, der vielen von uns nur allzu bekannt ist, den Perfektionismus.
When I am seeking to be perfect, I'm unattainable for people. I'm unreachable for people. I'm unrelatable for them. And truthfully, that's when I feel most safe. Or that's when I perceive myself feeling most safe.
Diese Episode ist definitiv mehr als ein Interview. Es ist ein ehrliches, tiefes Gespräch unter Männern, die versuchen, in einer immer lauter werdenden Welt ihrer inneren Stimme treu zu bleiben. Lass dich berühren und entdecke dank Alex' Geschichte vielleicht auch ein Stück deiner eigenen Wahrheit wieder. Alex, my friend, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure, brother. Thank you for the invite.
You're so welcome. It's actually interesting. I woke up this morning and I felt like, wow, I actually get to have a conversation with a dear friend of mine and record it, talking about topics that we both highly value and are deeply interested in and passionate about. And now we get to share it also with others. So it's such a pleasure, really, to have you here. I'm looking forward to this.
I agree with that. And there is really something unique within this platform and this way of spreading messages. And the listeners might not be aware of the fact that I as well have a podcast and I've had you as well on the podcast. So I'm very
Right.
familiar with this understanding that we have these conversations that we're both so passionate about, and any guests that we might bring on, and then we get to share with others and they as well receive value from that. So that's really special.
Exactly. And it also feels a little bit like bringing things full circle. I was on your podcast, and then I even played the interview that you did with me on my podcast, and now so you are here as well. So yeah, without any further information on that, brother, how are you doing today?
Well, first of all, I am doing phenomenal. I'm currently actually going through a bit of a study group. That's what my mentor calls it, with one of my dearest mentors within the realms of breath work. So I'm
Hmm.
currently very full-fledged in the role of the student, one that I deeply embody and one I deeply enjoy being in. And so this has been a quality that I've been in over the past week. And along with that as well, I've just enjoyed this idea of coming onto your podcast. So I was really looking forward to it.
Beautiful. Let's touch base on that for a little bit. You mentioned a certain quality, and you mentioned this notion of being a student that you deeply embody. And one thing that you really inspire me with is the humility you bring to studying and the depth you're seeking in your studies, both with men's work, which we will get to talk about more in a bit. But let's touch base a little bit on that quality of being a student that you just mentioned you're embodying, and what's that like for you these days?
Mm. Yeah, just to maybe bring a little bit of an understanding to this for the listeners, I would say I've always been an individual who's deeply sought to really understand the human experience. There was something
Hmm.
about me that has always asked myself the big questions. And if you were to
Hmm.
just look at my past and my history, you could point to certain events that have happened that had led me to really ask the bigger questions of life, to question myself, to really receive an understanding of who I am, but also why I do what I do. I think that is something that I'm very adept in. And stepping into the role of being a facilitator and a practitioner, I would say a lot of that eagerness that I initially had to support myself on my journey has translated over to this, with this notion of how do I support individuals to create transformative experiences for them. And so that
Hmm.
has been an eagerness that has deeply guided me over the last number of years. I would say there can be shadow aspects to this student, and I'm happy to as well talk about those if you think that
Hmm.
is supportive. But I would say that is essentially the way I see the student in me.
Hmm. There's a number of questions that result from that, and you already put one on the silver plate. What's the shadow aspect of that? You
Mm,
would say in your own experience, because from what I'm picking up, and I know this from myself, is like this feeling of always getting or almost getting caught up in in this eagerness of learning more, which can also lead to, at least from my in my experience, to a certain amount of discontentment, dissatisfaction with who I am and what I am and where I am. Always trying to be better, always trying to learn more, always trying to get somewhere else, kind of like losing touch with where I actually am already. How does that show up for you? What's the shadow aspect of being a student for yourself?
The question that we have to ask ourselves is, where are we coming from? And I think that is a good question to ask regardless of what we do. And so this is what I see happening in terms of the shadow aspect. You spoke to the humility that I have, and I would argue that's definitely a virtue that I strongly stand by. But I think the shadow aspect that I would love the listeners to know is that I have always, or for a long time, struggled with an internalized sense of shame, believing that there's something wrong with me, believing that I'm inadequate. And so I think there can be this default posturing of collapse and almost humiliation. That is the strong expression of humility, right? Where we feel humiliated, we're almost collapsed to our own sense of unworthiness. And so I would say the shadow aspect for me really comes in when we're doing the practice, when we're going to the workshop, when we're going to the retreat, when we're seeking to uh, improve our skills, when we're coming from this notion that we're not good enough as we are, and there's something broken about us and that we need to fix ourselves. And so I think
Right.
this is something to be very, very mindful, because when we're coming from that energy, we're actually reinforcing that we're not good enough. And I would say that is probably as well what increases that discontentment over time.
Yeah. It's coming from a place of lack, from a place of I'm seeking something in the external to fill me up in order to feel happy or feel content or feel whole. Whereas, what would be the other approach then? What would be the more integrated approach to that, where you can embrace the fact that you don't understand most things actually, which is what it comes down to with true humility,
Mm.
and develop this curiosity for life until your very last breath, perhaps, which I would consider something to be a goal for my own life, to stay a student and keep learning as long as I can. But what would be the other approach you would say that comes from a more integrated place, from a more confident place as well, where you don't put your own worth always somewhere in the back place?
I love this exploration and this inquiry, Jacob. And one of my teachers speaks about the distinction between seeking versus exploring, whereas seeking can come from this place of lack, the sense of there is something that there's a void that I'm seeking to fill, whereas exploration is coming from an understanding of I'm whole as I am, I'm complete as I am, and there is this innate sense of curiosity that is driving me,
Right.
that is guiding me. And I would say one component that I would say an explorer, quote unquote, truly embodies is that embrace of uncertainty, the embrace of I don't know. And I would argue if you can truly embody I don't know to a full level, there is a level of confidence that comes with that. Like I consider one of my mentors, Edward Dangerfield, who you might be familiar of.
Yeah.
I have certainly had him as well on my podcast a few times. And when I look at him, when he leads his breathwork sessions, it is truly coming from this place of, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And there's truly this sense of emergence that he's seeking to arrive to or get to. And just as well recognizing there is an emergence of life, there's a constant unfolding of life. And so when we don't get ahead of ourselves of trying to get somewhere and trying to be someone else other than who we are, I think that is truly when we can come from a place of curiosity and exploration. And I would say for every individual, they'll have innate curiosities, innate desires and explorations. But when we can come from this notion of there's nothing wrong with me and I'm really interested around this topic, I think that is a beautiful, those are beautiful tensions to hold.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, man. It also reminds me of quite a lot of the clients that I work with one-on-one. One of the main issues is the uncertainty causes so much fear. the fact that we don't know most of the things, especially not about the future, causes so much anxiety and stress. And when you can relax into the unknown, when you can really like surrender to what's about to happen, then things can change in a complete way. Yeah, you're about to say something to that.
I absolutely agree. And, I was just chuckling at myself because I definitely have massive control patterns and always trying to, always trying to predict my circumstances and like idealize them in such a way that are perfect for me and exactly how I want them to be. And I'm
Mm.
not sure if you're familiar with the philosopher Krishnamurti, but
Oh yeah.
one thing that really stood out for me in his books, which I would say is definitely something that I seek to uh, take into my life, is this understanding that we're actually not scared of the unknown, but
Mm.
rather we're scared of what we're projecting into the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And often that is based on our past experiences, particularly the ones that hurt us, the ones that scared us. And so we're imagining these worst case scenarios in this blank canvas, which is like the realm of
Mm.
the unknown, and then imagining, oh, this is going to happen. Let me protect myself from this thing that unbeknownst to me, I'm imagining onto the future. Like, how crazy is that?
That is awesome. I love your honesty, and I can see the way you answer this question. You're speaking from experience.
Mm.
And kind of like, so do I. I'm definitely familiar with those control patterns. And I'd love for you, whenever you feel called to share more about your personal experience with that, please just really drop it in. I think this is what makes those conversations also so valuable and accessible for the people who listen to, oh, yeah, this is how it shows up in his life, even though he has come a long way.
Mm. Yeah, let me speak
There's
to that right
still these
now.
patterns. Yeah,
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 let me
sure.
speak to that right now. So for me, the way it shows up the most is in perfectionism. And
Mm.
perfectionism is a strategy, it's a coping mechanism that I'd learned from a very young age. I received
Mm.
validation from my performance. And when I performed really well at something, then I would receive the care and the attention that I was often lacking in my childhood, particularly from my father. That was something I was deeply seeking. And so for
Mm.
me, the moments when I performed really well or did something really good, then I received his attention. But on the other hand, as well, the moments where I was less prepared, those were the moments where I would get hurt. And sometimes I think what I didn't realize at the time when I created or when I started practicing these adaptive strategies is I didn't have any control over those experiences. So there's been many instances, particularly in my teenage years, where, I was subject to bullying and having grown up in Germany, having been born there, but then as well moving to Canada, I was that weird German guy. And then
Mm.
when I was 17, we moved back to Germany, and then I was the weird Canadian guy. So I
Mm-hmm.
would say I was never the one who truly belonged. I would say that is arguably my biggest wound. And
Mm.
so as a result, I've been subject and prey to being teased, being laughed at. And so I can see how this mechanism towards perfectionism, towards controlling my environment, but also controlling myself, was really adapted to protect myself from essentially getting hurt, not recognizing how much it's actually hurting me by exercising it in my day and day. And
Mm.
it's interesting because right now, in my life circumstances, I'm really being asked, I'm really being called upon to soften these perfectionistic patterns back and actually allow my humanness to come forth, allow my realness to come forth, allow
Mm.
my messiness to come forth. And it's fucking scary. I just really want to acknowledge that. So, yeah, that's just maybe a bit of
Yeah.
a taster of how it's presenting itself for me.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, brother. How is it coming along? You say it's fucking scary?
Mm-hmm.
How is the real you showing up these days? Not maybe despite the fact that this wound of true belonging you mentioned is present or was present, being coped with
Mm-hmm.
perfectionism, but maybe because that was present. Because from what I'm hearing, a lot of that has also been part of an integration process that has happened, that has made you become more whole with that experience, with that being part of your story. How is that coming along these days?
I'm softening into it. And I would say a consequence of seeking to be perfect that I've really been sitting with recently is this recognition, this notion that when I am seeking to be perfect, I'm unattainable for people.
Mm.
I'm unreachable for people. I'm unrelatable for them. And truthfully, that's when I feel most safe. Or that's when I perceive myself feeling most safe.
Yeah, I know how
Yeah.
that feels. Yeah.
And so this is where I kind of like to be. My default way of operating is to be a little bit aloof, to be that guy who's a bit of a mystery. Because when I'm that guy, people can't touch me. They can't hurt me. But the great consequence that I would maybe just want to bring to the listeners is this recognition that I can't relate to other people, and other people can't relate to me, which is as well perpetuating this fear around relationships and intimacy and being close with other people. Because when I get close, then they can touch me. So I would say that is kind of the consequence. And I would say I'm truly getting to the stage where I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. Fuck it. I might get hurt.
Fuck it.
But that's actually what I want, because essentially what I'm really here about is relationships. And
Right.
I would say that's been my biggest wound, but that's also truly the place where I'm seeking some of my deepest healing.
Yeah.
So I would say that is a bit of an answer of how it's coming along.
That's a beautiful answer, man. Thank you. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by Rumi. You have to keep breaking your heart until it opens. Honestly, when I contemplated this quote many times, especially when I was scared of my heart being broken, not opening up fully, whether that's in an intimate relationship or whether that's towards friends or family, like this fear of being hurt, fear of having my heart broken, that's actually guiding you deeper and deeper into who you really are, coming from that place of I can relate to life, I'm open to life, and fuck it, it's part of life to be hurt. Yeah.
I think as well, one of the scary things that arises, and particularly when we speak about the male experience, is to really show ourselves, to really reveal our humanness. I would say it's almost a threat to who we've been taught to be. Whether it's in our familial settings, whether it's hearing it from our fathers, receiving those first impressions from him, whether it's from our culture, whether it's from society, there are certain impressions that we'll have received around how to be as men and who to be as men. And I see that I have a fear around being human among men, because if I were to truly allow myself to be seen in this way, my fear is that they won't trust me, and they won't recognize me anymore as competent and someone that they can trust to to lead with, let's just say. Whereas on the other hand, there is this fear of opening in this way towards the feminine, towards women, because if I do, there is this deep fear that they might lose attraction in me, but also lose respect. Almost like my deepest fear is that judgment of them towards me, that I'm not man enough. And that's also the fear that I have towards men. So I think there's a bit of that
Mm,
that I see playing out, which is making it so confronting to lean into what you had said around allowing our heart to be
mm,
to break open.
yeah. You are providing a beautiful segue into a deeper conversation around what it means to be a man. I know it's something that you're deeply passionate about inquiring for yourself and for others. It's part of your work as a men's coach and a relationship coach. You're also a breathwork facilitator. I'd love for you to speak also a little bit more about what you actually help people with and what the kind of setting is. Yeah, maybe let's start with that first, so we can provide a little bit of a context of where you're coming from, also with your work and your vocation, and then dive a little bit deeper into some of the questions that just arise from what you just shared, because I think it's so beautiful, and we can talk a lot about that.
Sure,
Yeah.
brother. Thank you for offering this invitation to me. Yeah, so I would say my work weaves into various elements, and I would say the elements that it weaves into are the very ones that I struggled with the most. So, as
Mm-hmm.
you've communicated, I'm a coach and I work exclusively with men. Of course, there might be instances where I might work with women or with couples, but generally, I exclusively work with men. And I see that there's four realms that I primarily work in with these men, which is this idea of men's development, this recognition of who we are as men, what it as well means to be a man. And I'm not here to tell anybody how to be a man or who to be as a man. I think that's a very arrogant way of exploring this conversation, but rather I'm here to support men on this inquiry of who is the man within you, who's the
Mm-hmm.
man in you that wants to be expressed. So I would say that's one element of how my work plays out. The other is more in the realms of emotional awareness, regulation, and then as well moving towards resilience. So many individuals that I work with have really had to disconnect themselves from their emotionality to essentially keep themselves safe from the world. So my journey is really in supporting them in bringing awareness to that and learning to regulate themselves. A big piece of that conversation is in the realms of the nervous system. So that's as
Right.
well where my work as a breathwork facilitator and a body worker weaves in. And then, of course, the conversation as well comes to this idea of resilience. And I like to bring in capacity and resilience. So, capacity, the way I see it, is really about stretching that bandwidth of what we can tolerate in a particular experience. And then
Mm-hmm.
resilience is really about when we have experienced a certain deficit or are coming out of an intense experience, how long does it take for us to return back into a state of regulation? So, this is really where I see this work going. And then the third realm is more around this conversation around relationships, where as well include the conversation around intimacy and sexuality. Essentially, for me, the way I see myself is more of a relationship coach in conversation of a man's relationship to himself. Because any challenges that he might come to me with around his relationship with his partner usually will fall back to his relationship with himself. So that's where I
Mm-hmm.
start, right? And that I essentially support him on a journey of discovering the aspects of himself that he had disowned, disconnected from, but also the aspects of himself that he might have blended with or merged with. Just consider how I've spoken about my perfectionist. I merged with that part of me, but that's not who I am. It's an aspect of me. It's a protective mechanism. And so I see that with a lot of individuals, they blend, they merge with certain aspects and they disconnect from others. And so for me, my journey is really about supporting them and integrating these aspects and then finding a sense of harmony. And then the question, of course, as well arises is how do I come into relationship with another, right? And then, of course, we can get into conversations such as polarity and sexuality. things that I'm deeply passionate about and deeply adept in terms of being as well a student of Tantra, and then as well yogic intimacy and sexual polarity for a few years now, almost 4 years. And I would say the last conversation comes more around this idea of self-leadership. So if we look at all these pillars that I've described now, is how can we bring that together in a coherent level and come into an understanding of why are we here, and having a vision for the future, and essentially looking at how can we lead our lives, how can we lead um, ourselves with and through the missions that we might have, essentially coming from our core and not needing to disconnect from any aspect, and as well staying in a relationship with others in the process. So those are kind of the core pillars that I focus on. And this is going to be more in the realms of embodied coaching, or as well as a breathwork facilitator. And of course, I'm as well very passionate about having such conversations as a podcast host. So that's a bit of a brief description of what I do.
That sounds amazing, man. I love how much clarity you bring through your words to that. It is not easy oftentimes to speak into that, and to especially speak into that from a place of experience, from a place of working with numerous people, and actually having a quite a broad spectrum of what people show up with. And that's what would be my first question that comes up listening to you. What kind of patterns do you recognize in individuals seeking your support in your one-on-one coaching? What is it that usually blocks men from tapping into that deeper, you said, the core of who they are? So maybe we can start by speaking a little bit into what is it actually, what is that core? It's not just a physical core. It's, as far as I understand it also, for myself, it's more like a centeredness, a groundedness, a deeper knowing of who I am, a connection with values, with virtues, with presence, like an embodied presence. Can you speak a little bit more into that, and then maybe continue by sharing what is the main blockages you recognize in men that keeps them from actually tapping into that potential within themselves?
Yeah, thank you, brother. And this is maybe where I might fumble a little bit with my words, just in this recognition that it's hard to communicate this idea of um, what our core is. Essentially, to me, it is really our essence. And the word that most closely connects to me with that is this idea of integration, right? So integrity, the Latin word essentially comes from the root wholeness, this idea that we're a whole self. And I see what happens for so many individuals is that we become fragmented, or at least we receive this notion or this perspective of fragmentation. We're not actually fragmented, but there's this notion that we're fragmented. And there's certain aspects of ourselves that we define as good and others that we define as bad. And so as a result, we contort ourselves and we distance ourselves from who we essentially are. Another way of looking at it is many individuals, and I can very much attest to that as well in my own experience. I would say that was what defined most of my life up until probably my mid-20s, is living my life from this position of who I need to be based on what I am seeking to get from others. For me, it was status, admiration, love, respect. And so I was open and willing to contort myself to those understandings, and I became very adept at becoming this adaptive chameleon and very sensitive, very attuned to this recognition of who do you need me to be, and I'll just become that. Whereas for me, a man who's truly at his core has a instinctive knowing, and instinctive is the word that I really want to highlight. It's a felt sense, it's an embodied sense of this is who I am. And it's not just this like mental understanding of who I am, but it's like a feeling sense of this is who I am as a man. And I'm going to be in a sense of congruence with what I feel inside and what I present to the world.
Mhm.
So for me, it comes back to these ideas of integrity, this understanding of the aspects that we might have disconnected from, reconnecting to those, experiencing that sense of wholeness from within, and then living our lives with a sense of congruency. And then, of course, coupling that with a sense of virtue, understanding what are the values that we aspire for? What are the ones that matter most to us? One of mine is courage. One of mine is authenticity. And when I bring my awareness to these virtues, it is a constant exploration around exercising them into my beingness.
Mm.
So
Let,
I'm
let me
fumbling
jump in here
around.
for a second. No, I think you're getting straight to the point, and it's super interesting to listen. Um, how would courage, exercising the virtue, the, the value, one of your core values I understood of courage in your daily life, how would that show up, for example?
It's a great question. And I think one thing that I might just want to bring in before I answer that is I
Mm-hmm.
believe a lot of people misunderstand this notion and this idea of courage. They
Mm-hmm.
believe that courage comes in spite of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that courage comes as a result of fear.
Right.
Without fear,
Mm.
without actually feeling fear, we
Mm.
don't have anything to step into.
Yeah, I
We
love
don't
that.
have
Mm.
courage to step into.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say courage is something that we exercise. It's a muscle that we strengthen as a result of feeling fear.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, this is the way it presents itself. Even in this conversation, I can still notice these aspects of me that are maybe somewhat fearful and afraid.
Mm.
How might I be perceived? What will other people think of me? And even in such moments, there can be this deep ask towards stepping into courage. And,
Mm-hmm.
I see it in my day-to-day life. It's just this constant inquiry around where my fear is and stepping into what's most true
Mm.
on the other side
Mm.
of that.
Mm. And that can be scary as fuck.
Of course, man. Absolutely.
Mm. Hey, ganz kurz erlaube ich mir, das Gespräch mit Alex zu unterbrechen, weil es mir ein echtes Herzensanliegen ist, Männern auch im echten Leben mehr Raum zu geben, um mit sich selbst, der Natur und ihrer authentischen Männlichkeit in Verbindung zu treten. Deshalb findet unser Mann-Sein-Retreat heuer schon zum 3. Mal statt, und zwar von 5. bis 10. August inmitten eines herrlich ruhigen Naturambientes am Haberghof im Burgenland. 5 gemeinsame Tage, in denen wir Männer uns mit unseren Rollen, Werten, Verantwortungen und ungelebten Potenzialen auseinandersetzen. Ein Retreat für Männer, die ihren Wurzeln auf die Spur gehen und sich dabei selbst auf einer tieferen Ebene erfahren möchten. Gemeinsam bauen wir die Brücke zwischen der Naturverbundenheit unserer Vorfahren und dem Spirit einer neuen Zeit, um dem Leben mit einem ganzheitlichen männlichen Selbstbewusstsein zu begegnen. Dieses Retreat ist eine Einladung, mit dir selbst und anderen Männern auf authentische und vertrauensvolle Weise in Kontakt zu treten. Wenn du diese transformative Retreat-Erfahrung mit uns machen möchtest, findest du unter dem Link in den Shownotes mehr Infos und einige wundervolle und berührende Erfahrungsberichte aus den vergangenen Jahren. Wenn du noch Fragen hast zum Retreat, melde dich sehr gerne auch persönlich bei mir unter mail@jakobhorvath.com, sehr gerne auch in einem persönlichen Call. Talking about your experience with other men, I feel like there are so many concepts, so many ideas of what it means to be a man, who we should be, who we should not be. And there is this like very old, almost ancient notions on what that means. Speaking about patriarchal systems, speaking about men, doesn't show emotions, all of that. But that's kind of like the one extreme of the spectrum. And then now, lately, there has entered very new concepts and ideas of what it needs to be a man, talking about vulnerability, talking about, yeah, a man actually shows their emotions, but then what? So I feel like there's so many ideas and concepts about what that means, being a man in 2025, that it gets so confusing and overwhelming to most people. So I guess the question that I'm most curious about is how do we as men really find what you spoke into before? What's the man inside of me that wants to come alive? Like, what does it mean? And it's a very individual inquiry and experience. No one else can tell me, actually. How do we step into that? How do we get rid of the societal concepts and blockages that keep us from actually moving into that space?
It's a really great conversation, and I think there is numerous approaches that one can take. I don't think there is one right way to do it. And,
Mm.
as well, I would be really open to hear your own thoughts on this. But what I see is we have to essentially establish an environment where we can separate ourselves from our conditioned self towards what's actually true.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there needs to be environments where we can allow ourselves to be still and
Mm-hmm.
to essentially be with ourselves. And I think this is maybe one of the great challenges that we've truly experienced within our current times is this deep sense of overstimulation that we're experiencing at so many levels that we have almost lost that inner whisper within ourselves, this
Mm-hmm.
understanding of who we really are at our core. So I think there is an element around separating ourselves from our environment or incorporating deliberate moments where we block out and remove ourselves from the noise. And essentially, it's truly about investing time with ourselves. You know, one of the things I might just share with the listeners is when I was 22 and ended up leaving Germany for good because I essentially started traveling the world. And for me, it began more as a backpacker and then living in various countries doing working holiday visas. And for me, it was really important during that time to separate myself from my conditioned environment, which is
Mm-hmm.
what I did. Because it is in that environment that I constantly reinforced who I
Mm-hmm.
believed myself to be, but then as well, other people reflected back to me who they thought I was. They thought I was this insecure, shy, timid man, essentially. And it was in my first travel experiences where I started realizing, oh, I don't have to actually embody this character any longer. Nobody knows me here. I can recreate myself in a new way. I mean, of
Mm-hmm.
course, there is something to say around my habituated ways of being, which, eventually would come back online again. But there is something to say about the power of environment. And that doesn't mean one needs to leave their environment, but creating pockets where we're able to separate ourselves from the environment that constantly reflects back to us who they think we are, but also where we're projecting who we believe ourselves to be. So I think that's a really big piece. And I think another one for me has really been spending a lot of time on my own. Like, I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
really big one. And really being in stillness, being with nature, and just noticing what would come up, noticing the thoughts that would come up, noticing the fears that would come up, noticing the emotions that would come up. One can see it truly as spending time with myself, almost maybe even having dates with myself.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm just with myself and I'm just intimate with my own experience. I consider what a rarity it is to really truly spend time with ourselves in such an intimate way. And so
Mm,
I would say those have been some incredible components for me. But I think another aspect that I would as well name to you is relationships
mhm,
and finding trusted individuals who are able to reflect back to me what they saw in me, and then being able to as well consider that and play around with that and test it for myself. And then, of course, we can go into the entire realm of working with an individual who is truly adept at seeing us
mm,
and seeing our patterns and supporting us in that. But those are some, some few ideas that come up just in this initial inquiry.
mm. Yeah, that's great. I would love to follow that flow of our conversation. You mentioned relationships, so let's talk about intimate relationships,
Mm,
partnerships.
sure.
Um, let's focus for the sake of understandability on relationships between men and women.
Mm,
That being said, it also applies to all kinds of relationships you find yourself in, because these kind of like, let's call it energy dynamics, they just work. Whether you're in a male body, whether you're in a female body. And to me, what really became like very, very fascinating to me, the deeper I dove into that kind of work, is how we can show up so differently once we understand it, first of all, on a mental
mm,
level, but then, of course, it has to be embodied, it has to become a thing in your experience, how these energies work.
yeah.
So, maybe to open up that conversation, are there certain aspects of masculinity, you would say, like virtues, certain qualities in a masculine presence that
Mm-hmm,
women look out for, that women
mm-hmm,
feel attracted to naturally,
mm-hmm.
but also that men can inquire into to go deeper into this understanding who they actually really are as a man?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think I would want to preface here with this understanding and notion that I'm not a woman. So I cannot speak from my own personal nor anecdotal experience, but
Sure.
rather what I can communicate is more my observations with
Right.
being with intimate partners myself, but also being in conversations with, friends, or being also in workshop spaces, and like just having these constant inquiries and conversations um, in various spaces.
Hmm.
You spoke to this idea of different energies, and I guess what we're really bringing in here is these understandings around the masculine or feminine energy, and this is how it's often spoken of. And truthfully, I'm starting to step a little bit away from these terms, because I can recognize that they can be so charged in our
Hmm.
culture, because they're so. I
I
think what
agree.
a lot of people are mistaken is. This understanding of identity and gender within
Yeah.
that expression and energetic, and they conflate it with their identity as a man, their identity as a woman. And I think that creates a lot of difficulties where essentially it comes back to energetic expressions and
Hmm.
energetic principles that each of us can access. There's different ways of communicating to these principles. Um, Justin Patrick Pierce, an individual that I'm really inspired by, he speaks about this idea of the alpha principle, which is the masculine principle, whereas the feminine principle is the um, omega. We can, of course, speak as well about the yang principle and the yin principle. Michaela Bohm as well speaks about this idea of go and flow energy. So I think when we use terms such as that, it creates just a little bit of distance between who we know ourselves to be, or the way we classify ourselves, and these expressions that we can essentially embody. And so what I've observed, at least in my experiences, again, my personal experiences, working with clients, being surrounded and immersed in such spaces, what I found, what draws a lot of women in, and again, I'm not generalizing for every woman, I want to be clear with that, but most women is going to be a sense of groundedness,
Mm.
a sense of centeredness, a sense of stillness, presence. A man who's able to access an element of depth,
Mm-hmm.
one that can embody a space of clarity to her, a sense of embodied depth. Maybe that's an addition that I would want to provide to depth. So not just a depth that one can see, but you can truly feel he's transmitting it through his body. He's
Mm.
inhabiting it within his body.
Mm.
A man who's able to provide safety and containment just through his beingness. A man who you can see knows himself, but doesn't use that information to become rigid, but has also some form of access to play, maybe even humor, maybe some form of confident cheekiness, maybe a bit of a playful arrogance almost, but still has humility and can still stay safe. So he's not rigid in one or the other. I
Mm.
think I think a beautiful balance is definitely this play between that structure, that stability,
Mm.
and that openness as well. And if we can
Mm.
couple those two, I think those can be a beautiful expression to come from.
Yeah, I love how you speak into that. And it provides, I think, a really good framework where we can move forward a little bit into understanding, yeah, those are masculine energy principles that are also alive in a woman.
Absolutely.
And it's ultimately it's all about the balance. I mean, that's what the ancient teachings of all areas of the world have been telling us. Come back into the middle path.
Mm,
You know, find that sweet spot between the extremes. Find the yin and the yang when it connects as a whole circle. And so I'd love for you to speak a little bit also, you know, recognizing that a lot of our listeners are women.
mm,
And one of the questions I've been asked many times by women, actually, whether that's in one-on-one settings, whether that's in retreat settings or in workshop settings, or just people reaching out, hey, how can I support my partner, my
yeah,
male partner,
right.
to actually step into his own depth, into his,
Mm,
like, even approaching that sense of who he is. Because what I'm noticing is that a lot of women actually are far ahead of us men, and I'm
right.
very, generalizing things now, but the inner work that women do, I think we as men can learn a lot from that, like
Mm,
the consciousness that comes from that in our
yeah.
timeline, in our current, the quality of where we are on this planet. I think it's very, very important that we as men kind of like keep up. And so, what is it that, in your observation, how can women support men on this
Yeah.
journey?
It's such a beautiful question, and I just want to honor any woman that is bringing that in as a curiosity, that really
Mm.
wants to support her man in this way, because it
Mm.
truly shows, for me, it truly is an expression and it's a reflection of love. So I just want to honor that in any woman,
Mm.
for wanting to support her man in that. And I think what I would just maybe want to bring And again, I want to clarify, I'm not a woman, so I don't know what that experience must be like. But what I hear from so many women is this conversation and this importance around physical safety. You know, Jacob, I think for us as men, we don't ever question our sense of safety in terms of our physicality, right? We can go out into the streets, and generally, in
Mm,
most environments, we won't necessarily feel that fear towards our safety.
right.
And from the accounts of what I've heard with so many women, um, I see that as very much the opposite. Now, why am I bringing that in? I think it's important to give them this understanding, just in the recognition that that unsafety that they might feel physically, this
Mm,
is what a lot of men experience emotionally. Like, this
mm,
is the realm that from an
mm.
early age, as little boys, we're taught to shut ourselves down from.
Right. It's not who you are is not who you need to be. You need to be someone else.
Mhm.
Your emotions are
Yeah,
not welcome. Yeah.
I think one of the greatest fears that so many men has is shame.
Hmm.
It's judgment. And then what gets coupled on to it is the fear of shame, the
Mm,
shame of shame.
hmm.
And I believe any man who is afraid of stepping into a deeper expression of himself, that's essentially what you'll find in that man.
Mm.
And so I
Oh
meet
yeah.
that with a lot of compassion
Yeah.
that this man will most likely from an early age have been told who he is not okay
Mm.
and he needs to be someone different,
Right.
you
And
know?
then what's certainly not helpful is if you then come and you say, hey, I want you to be this. I want you to come to yoga with me. I
Yeah.
want you to, you know, look for a coach, or I want you
Hmm.
to go on this retreat with me in order to learn whatever. Because then this might get triggered. This actual core wound might get triggered. So yeah, okay, again, what I'm doing is not right. Like who I am is not
Exactly.
right. I need to be
Yeah.
someone different. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. There's that sense of I'm not doing enough, I'm not enough, I'm doing something
right.
wrong that comes up.
Exactly.
And then we feel a sense of shame as a result. So I believe demanding it out of a man will
Mm.
usually not work. And again, I meet it with compassion because I understand that in so many women there is this deep yearning to go into
Yeah.
that depth, right? And I think there is something to say about bringing or revealing one's emotional experience without needing something from him.
Mhm.
So, another way to put it, I consider certain experiences I might have had with past partners where there would be a sense of dissatisfaction that they experienced towards anything that was going on. And
Mm.
the moments I received them the most when they simply reflected back to me what my actions or my behavior was doing to them. So
Mhm.
essentially, they were revealing the impact of my behavior. And
Yeah.
often it would be just this open expression of sadness. It can be also anger, but not anger directed towards me. It's just this expression coming through as a result of the impact that they felt. I hope I'm delivering this clearly, but if we can bring this, our expression, hey, I'm noticing the sadness, but not directing it at somebody, I think there is
Mm.
something in the masculine psyche for a lot of men that want, I believe a lot of men answer and respond to the call of being challenged
Mhm.
and being asked to step into something.
Right.
Yet, if it's demanded from us, then our defensiveness comes up.
There is a fine line, I
Yeah,
reckon. It's a fine line, and it's not easy to find that sometimes.
absolutely, brother. And I'm sure you've as well experienced that within yourself,
Oh
right?
yeah, for sure. In many different ways. I'd love to speak into that a little bit more. What came up for me right now when you said that was because you were asking if you're delivering this clearly, it's what it comes down to is the relationship being a mirror. Your partner is mirroring you. And if it's a female partner, she will mirror it through her emotions, for example, because that's what's most accessible to women. It's not so much the ratio, the masculine kind of like mind thinking, trying to understand, trying to explain, whereas she's in her fluidity, in her emotions that got somehow connected and triggered, perhaps even by the behavior of me as a man, for example. And then now if I look at her and say, hey, you are, again, this or that, you know, stop complaining, you're complaining all the time. But if I can see it as a mirror, not projecting now onto her, but actually seeing myself in this mirror, it's like, oh, wow, what's my part in this?
Yeah.
Where can I look myself into the mirror and see, oh, this is actually a shadow part of me that I haven't recognized yet. I'm having the chance here to learn something about myself. I can recognize myself on a deeper level, and therefore I can find out deeper layers of who I am.
Yeah.
Who I am beyond the patterns that play out in my relationship over and over again. So I think this is, from what I understand, from how I understand you, what you meant with relationships can teach us who we actually are as a man. And I like what you said in one of our pre-conversations to this interview. It's not about being a good man, but it's about becoming good in being a man. Which is kind of like a very different approach, I reckon.
Yeah, and I think everyone has to really ask themselves and really go through the conversation around, well, what does it actually mean to be good at being a man? And, I think there is, again, there is no defined, definitive way of looking at this conversation. And I don't want to display that as an idea. And I'm very happy as well to share with the listeners just my own understandings of what I've discovered. So just to maybe give a little bit of an understanding to this idea of what it means to be good at being a man.
What does it mean to you?
I think for me, it is really about this idea about having emotional range. So if we want to consider this idea of having access to all these different emotions, or we have the plethora of emotions within the spectrum, our capacity to be able to step into one, embody it, and as well simulate whatever is required in a moment, I think that is definitely one component. I believe it is leading a life of virtue. It could be in certain qualities such as strength, courage, mastery, something that is important to you, and refining towards a certain skill. I think to me, it's also incredibly important for a man to know himself physically. This doesn't mean that he requires to have a strong, very built physique in the classic sense. But I do believe it requires a man to know himself physically.
Right. How would
And
that show up?
feel confident in his physicality and
Right.
his capacity to move. Right. I mean, this is something that I've been exploring recently, to step more into martial arts and jujitsu. And I think there is a great value for men to explore things such as martial arts. Right. And that
I
capacity to
agree.
recognize there is a warrior in us. There is an instinctual part in us that wants to protect. Yet the question is, do we have access to this aspect of ourselves? Are we able to exercise that? So it shows up in this way. But also, of course, beyond just accessing that element of a warrior, do we as well have access to our hearts, essentially? whether it's in connection to ourselves, but also in connection to others.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have that access, we're going to be deemed as incredibly unsafe in relationship to other people. And
Right.
when it comes to the conversation around being good at being a man, I think this is also an aspect that we have to consider, which is to be good at being a man will reside within a relationship. So what makes me a worthwhile individual within the tribe?
Yeah. What I'm picking up from this also is this holistic approach to it. You mentioned the heart, you mentioned the body, you mentioned the emotions. And to me, that also means being connected to the feeling, the felt sense of an emotion, not thinking. I think a lot of men, and me included in the past, I have come a long way in this, but a lot of men are thinking their emotions. When you ask them, how are you doing? And they will tell you what they've been doing this day. And having access to how that actually translates in the body, the felt sensations of what is moving, if an emotion like anger or rage is present, like very hard, that holds a lot of charge. So how does that charge show up in the body? And then we can actually operate from a more embodied place and respond to the challenges of life, whether that's in relationship or in our careers, from this more centered place. That's how I understand it, and that's how I also feel it, and that's how my whole life has really changed once I started to tap deeper and deeper into that, with its own challenges showing up every now and then again, of course. But I guess what I'm trying to lead this conversation into is that the physique, like living in your body that you just mentioned as well, and having this understanding of what your body is capable of doing, also includes these very subtle feelings that you are connected to them, and not living your whole life out of the mind, thinking all of it. And then when it comes to important decisions like, which career path do I want to take? Why am I really here? To not answer that from a just heady perspective, or who am I in this relationship, for example, but actually feeling what is true for you. You need to feel that on a much deeper level.
I agree, and it is such a complex conversation, and it's not something that one will embody, discover, find an answer towards, in one day. I mean, it took me years to really get there. So yeah, I just really want to as well acknowledge the fact that yes, a lot of us get conditioned into thinking our feelings more, and I think again, as children, we don't have to think about feeling our feelings; we just feel them. But then we get conditioned out of that. And then we have these protective mechanisms that stop us from feeling that. So essentially, we got to unlearn these adaptive strategies so to actually access the feeling again. And I would say definitively, we'll probably not be able to do that on our own. And this is really where the support of other individuals comes in, and finding spaces where that are safe and provide containment to us, where we can actually trust ourselves to soften and let go into that space that is being offered and provided to us. And I would say that is one way of how we learn to access our emotionality again. And I think in terms of this understanding of who we are as men and as well in relationships, I think that just it also is a conversation that we have to reflect upon simply through living life. We need to have lived life. We need to have had experiences. We need to have had heartbreak. We need to have had grief. We need to have made mistakes and fucked up and have had experiences that taught us something. Oh, I felt shame about this. Why? Let me just inquire into that. What does this show me about my value system in terms of like what's important to me? So essentially, life is this revelatory place that constantly shows to us, or is trying to reveal to us who we really are. But the
Mm,
question is, are we listening? And
yeah.
are we actually doing something about this information?
Mhm.
I could go on and I could ramble, but I think these
I
are some
could, I
elements
could,
I'm seeing.
I could just listen for, much longer. But also in respect to our conversation slowly, coming also to an end. I hear you, man, and I think it can take a lot of pressure off, especially men that are still in this performance kind of like I need to be somewhere where I'm not state of
Mm,
mind. Take off the pressure and just start listening and start having those experiences in life. To me personally, what was a huge shift in how I perceived myself and me moving through life was when I realized it's not about getting somewhere, it's about having experiences.
hmm,
What you just mentioned, like have life be your playground.
hmm,
Include the heartbreak, include the pain, include all of the discomfort, like the uncomfortable experiences and emotions as something that shapes you into the human being that you're meant to be. Not according to some standards out there, and that applies to both men and women, of course. Not according to a conditioning or a framework that society wants us to operate in, to function, but actually to unfold as the wonderful beings that we are from the core, from our essence. Now I could go on like this, but it's not. I just try to, put a little bit of a personal note to that, what you just mentioned, because I agree
yeah.
so much and I feel so much resonance to what you just said.
And if I may just add something to that, because I loved what you as well contributed here, because I think it's just so valuable. For me, it is really about the balance between like having a goal-oriented way of living versus a more process-oriented way of living.
Mm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think this is something
Mm-hmm.
that, unbeknownst to me, I truly stepped into. Because, like, one of the
Mm.
things that I saw a lot with my dad was his need to get somewhere and
Mm.
his constant need to for more and accomplish something. And I think his own notions or understandings of success came in the way. And I think that has led in many ways to my own
Mm.
wound around the absence of his presence and the absence
Mm.
of connection and relationship. And I saw as well the suffering that it caused, which had
Mm.
led to my own value or virtue for more, I'm going to say, happiness. Now, I think what I didn't recognize at the time is that I simply wanted to search for happiness because I was feeling so much pain and grief. So I
Mm.
think there was also in me this aspect of denying my reality and wanting to be happy because simply I was just being so miserable. But I think the place
Mm.
that I'd really gotten to in many ways, and I think fills me with a lot of fulfillment when I can truly come from that place, and
Mm.
trust me, I lose it
Mm.
all the time, is really allow life to be this journey of growth, this journey of
Mm.
learning something, and allowing the journey of life to be more one of exploring meaning and aliveness versus trying to get somewhere or trying to
Mm.
become something. And I
Yeah.
think as long as I constantly follow my own sense of aliveness and what elicits an experience of meaning in me, there is a natural unfolding of becoming that is happening, but it's not so forced upon my ideas of the mind that
Mm.
are more projections around my unmet needs from childhood and trying to get something.
Mm.
I hope this is all
Mm.
making sense.
Absolutely, man. I love what you just said, and I couldn't agree more, honestly.
Mm,
Um, I'm aware that this what I'm asking you right now is a whole conversation in itself, and
sure.
I'm pretty sure we will have one around that. But I don't want to conclude our interview today without also getting into this just a little bit, because we talked about how women can support men on
Yeah.
their journeys of growth. But vice versa, how can men support women stepping into their feminine power as well, because I
Mm-hmm.
think what, especially in nowadays societies where it's all like about masculine qualities in business, about
Mm-hmm.
performance, goal orientated, like women, a lot of women feel pressure to be just a better man in order to
Mm-hmm.
progress in
Sure.
life in general. And what is equally valuable, the feminine qualities that
Yeah.
women bring into life, like intuition, like flow, like
Mm-hmm.
spontaneity, like playfulness, like
Mm-hmm.
emotions and energy in itself,
Yeah.
is completely undervalued and underrated. And therefore, I'd love to ask you also a little bit where's the polarity a little bit misunderstood as well, where it takes away power from women by leaning into men, for example, like surrendering into
Mm-hmm.
masculine presence and actually therefore
Mm-hmm.
giving away
Mm-hmm.
responsibility, perhaps leading into
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
codependency. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and then transitioning into the question, how can men actually support women on their journeys into their sovereignty and authentic power?
Yeah, so I see that these are two distinct separate subject matters. So I just want to maybe
Yeah,
speak to the first one around how men can
yeah,
support their women, and then we
right,
can go more around this conversation around um, sourcing one's safety from a partner.
right.
A common expression and saying, especially in the realms of polarity, which I've come as well to really believe from my own personal experiences, is that this understanding that the masculine principle grows through challenge, whereas the feminine principle grows through praise. And I think this is something that I, when I have truly exercised that in my relationships to women, when I didn't project my own ways of how I want to be supported onto her,
Mm-hmm.
and simply recognized the best way that I can support her is by seeing her fully,
Mm-hmm. I
by
love that.
being with her fully,
Yeah.
by feeling her fully, by doing my best to know who she is. Because when I'm able to step into this ability to see her fully and to know who she is, I've seen from my experiences that this is where many women blossom.
Mm,
This is where they become more radiant and strong. And
mm,
again, I want to distinguish that, this strength, because I think in so many ways our conditioned mind will associate it more towards like our projected masculine associations towards strength. But as you had communicated, it's a very different form of strength, which is more in this conversation around one's radiance,
mm,
one's intuitive capacities, one's deep sensing capacities. Those are gifts that women have access to, that I don't have access to the same degree.
yeah.
I can exercise those and I can
Mm,
strengthen them, but I see it time and time again that
mm, yeah.
I just don't have that same capacity
Yeah.
to the same level. And I think it is also about appreciating our differences. And I think this is
Mm,
a conversation for,
mm,
how men can support women and women can support men.
right.
We are
Right.
trying to make each other like the other person. And I think that it just doesn't work. We have to
Right.
honor each other's differences,
Cheers to that.
right? Like
Yeah.
appreciate your woman for being a woman and appreciate your
Mm,
man for being a man. Of
and
course, he's
don't.
not going to be so connected to
Mm,
his emotionality. Of
yeah.
course. It's
Yeah.
not his way of being. Of
Yeah.
course, she's a lot more connected to her emotionality. And sometimes we'll have moments where, she is just taken in the flow of what her experience is. She's a woman.
And basing her decisions on her emotions and not so
Exactly.
much on the rational thinking. And that's one of the
Yeah.
main differences that I see play out in relationships as a major
Yeah.
potential for conflict. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think if we could just step away from this like criticism and this judgmental
Mm, it's
nature
beautiful.
of
Yeah.
wanting our partners to be different than who they are,
Right.
but seeing the partner that we're truly with,
Mm,
like if people just take this and just run with it, I think it will definitely support their relationships.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally.
So that's on the first question. Do you still want to go
Mm,
into that second question?
of course.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, let's do that, man.
I give you a personal example? Maybe that
Please.
would
That's
bring you.
great.
Okay, I was 2 years ago. I was with a woman that was like I was strongly attracted to her. She was strongly attracted to me. I would even say
Mm,
like we fell in love like very quickly, and it was
mm,
like this bloom of excitement and enthusiasm. And even flew half across the world to meet her again. Um, and then what turned out was, in terms of speaking about polarity, that I was overwhelmed by the expectations of her being in her full feminine,
yeah,
expecting me to step up into my masculine,
right.
into leadership, which meant guiding us along the way, like figuring out routes to go with the
Yeah.
car, places to go visit, places to go eat in restaurant, which I had
Mm,
no idea about because it was her home and not mine. I would have
yeah.
to put a lot of work and research into this.
Yeah.
So naturally, she was in a more masculine, like leadership quality because it was where she
Mhm.
lived most of her life. And
Yeah.
then the other part was like, you know, paying for bills and being in this. I had the feeling like she was really expecting me to be someone I'm not in this moment. And
Mm,
that's where I, for the first time at an experienced level, realized this doesn't work for me so well. It became very
sure.
heady. I started to overthink the polarity, the dance of polarity. I felt
Yeah.
there was very little space for actually also being in my feminine as a man
Mm,
and for her stepping up into her masculine as a woman. I felt like this dance wasn't really happening, so it felt completely off. I actually left
yeah.
earlier than I planned because it just didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, and I
I
would love for you to speak into a little bit how we can get this wrong as well, how we can
mm,
overthink it, how it can just become another concept that overwhelms us.
First of all, I appreciate your vulnerable story. So thank you for sharing that. And I can relate to that. I've definitely been in
Mm,
experiences in that. And I'm like, oh shit, because there's so many aspects that I'm seeing that I could speak to where I'm like, all right, like let me see if I can bring all of what I'm seeing in a very concise way. But essentially, what I'm seeing is a big dilemma, especially within the realm of the polarity world that so many individuals are getting into, is they're getting they're mistaking this idea of bringing polarity to a moment where they want to have that polarized tension to
mm,
believing that polarity always needs to be present.
right. Mm,
So I think that's just a really big distinction that I want to just offer. Just this recognition that if we're going to do life together, right? If we're going to live together, some couples even have businesses. Some couples have children. If you're going to play in any of those realms, you're definitely going to be in an environment where you're not going to be polarized,
mm,
right? And if any individual here is listening to this conversation, I would highly encourage you to listen to my conversation with Justin Patrick Pierce and London Angel Winters because they specifically
mm,
teach about this, right?
mhm,
They are a couple who've been together for now, I believe, 15 years. They're running a business together, they have a child together, and they still live polarized relationships. But they also have an understanding we're not always going to be in polarity, but rather it's about understanding when do we actually want polarity and when will it be okay, we're just in uh we're going to be in alpha mode. That's going to be their conversation. So it's going to be, we're going to be two businessmen coming together. In relationship to their daughter, they're also going to be alpha. There's not going to be that polarity, right? So just recognize that there is going to be many moments in day-to-day living where that polarity might not exist. I consider as well one of my more recent partners who was a lot more adept at structure and scheduling things and planning things and organizing things than I was. That is not so much my skill. This is something that she'd done for many decades. So one could argue that she was more polarized towards the masculine pole in that aspect, whereas I was more in the feminine pole in the other. Now, I believe where the conversation becomes interesting is, can we bring an understanding towards those moments when we want to be playing in a specific pole? So as an example, a woman wants to be in the feminine pole and a man wants to be in a masculine pole. Let's say more in the bedroom or, out on a date. Are we able to harness those qualities in those moments? Usually, for a man, it's going to be to embrace some of those qualities that I've communicated around stillness, presence, depth. For me, it's really about accessing that through an embodied lens. Whereas for women, it's going to be a lot more about accessing her sense of flow, pleasure, finding her own radiance, being able to access more of a being energy and a following energy, whereas the man is more accessing a leading energy, right? But essentially, it is a conversation around having a clear culture of agreement and having a shared reality around how often do we want to be in a state of polarity. It sounds to me like that partner you were with wants to be in a constant state of polarity, and maybe that was just completely unrealistic. And so I think having some conversations around this, around how often do we want to be in that, and then establishing structures to ensure that we can create these polarized moments. Like it might be that when, let's say, a couple is working together within the same house and both are in a workflow, that there is some transition time that is required for the women to actually come out of alpha/work mode and doing mode and to access more of a being mode. Maybe, that is through accessing her pleasure, or maybe that's through dance. Maybe it's through running a bath. Maybe it's like listening to music, what it is for her. And the question as well is, well, what does the man really need to do in order to step into that masculine principle? Maybe it is to drop everything and just be in a state of being. Maybe it is getting into his physicality and being more directive in the way that he moves his body. And then coming together in these polarized ways together. And of course, there's a lot of skills that we can as well learn around how to come together in these ways where one partner amplifies the masculine principle, whereas the other partner amplifies the feminine principle.
Yeah, and this is, I knew before I asked the question, it's a whole conversation itself, and I would love to have you on the podcast to go deeper into this. I'll definitely link the interview with Justin in the show notes for those who already want to go deeper and listen to this conversation. Yeah, and also noting that this experience with that particular woman that I just shared, I'm also deeply grateful for her, She has been such a teacher. She has taught me a lot about feminine pleasure, about sensuality, about flow, and also holding the mirror like right in front of my face. I was just really overwhelmed by that, honestly. It was like, but it was my lack of capacity to deal with it also. So I'm not just like putting it all on her and saying, no, I'm actually really grateful for that experience in many different ways. So just wanted to add that. So if people resonate with your work and with your being, with your energy, and they would love to reach out or would love to perhaps even work with you, how can they find you?
Thanks for asking that, my friend. Yeah, there's numerous ways to find me. I would say predominantly you'll find me on Instagram. So I think that's the best platform to reach me. Along with that as well, I have a podcast called Heart of Man, which you'd be able to access on all the main streaming platforms. I'm as well on YouTube. So I think those are some ways to access me. And as mentioned, I work exclusively, mostly with men, but at times I as well work with women. So, as well, if a woman here is listening in and feels compelled um, to reach out, I wouldn't want that to um, take her away from reaching out. So, and again, I just want to as well, come back to maybe just my podcast because, I've just put so much love into that thing. And,
Mm,
if you want to gain some value from that, I think that would be as well very meaningful to me.
yeah, I highly encourage people to check out your podcast, whether men or women. One can hear and feel how much love and passion you put into this. Yeah, bro, let's wrap up this conversation. We could go on much longer. We could go on for hours, perhaps,
I
which we
know,
have been
man.
doing. We have been doing in so many other personal conversations. And what I really love about this one is it has really felt like a deep talk with a dear friend. We have been
Mm,
holding each other in times of challenge and turmoil.
yes.
And it's been just such a joy, really, to diving into these topics and having the audio recorder on for sharing this with both our audiences. And it has been wonderful. I really want to express my deepest gratitude for that to you.
Thank you so much, brother. I absolutely agree. It's been such a joy. I notice myself feeling more like I have more energy as a result of this experience. And as you know, we had difficulties with the technology before, and I was just
Yeah,
getting in my head, and it was really fucked up. But like, just look at me now. Like, I feel amazing, right? And it's due to this
same,
experience that we
same.
got to have. It's due to this conversation that we got to have. And I'm noticing as well a slight irritation because these conversations are so like ones that I'm so passionate about, and they're so
Mm,
nuanced, and I notice I'm not able to articulate everything that I want to articulate in this one way and package
of
it together
course,
because there's so much. But
of course.
that's the tension of having such conversations, and it's something that I take in wholeheartedly.
That's beautiful. I can reflect that back. Certainly, a little behind the scenes comment here. We have tried 75 minutes prior to this conversation to get the video and the audio going, and for some reason, it just didn't want to work. So I'm really even more happy now that we made it happen.
I agree.
Alex, one very last question to you, and you can answer this in one word, in one sentence,
Mm.
briefly. Uh, it's a question that has been asked many, many times to people, and I just think it has so much value. What's an advice you'd love to give your 20-year-old self, just
Mm.
coming out of its teenage years? What would be one thing I'd say, like, hey, bro, this I want you to know?
Mm. I love this question, and truthfully, I don't think I would want to give him any advice. All I would want to tell him is, you're fucking incredible. Like, I
Mm,
would just really love to
wow.
reflect to him who he is, and I would like to I would like to show him how I see him. I would like to give him an experience of that and just let him do whatever he wants with that because
Mm,
that's what he really needed. He doesn't need advice. He needs someone to tell me he's beautiful. He's incredible as he is. And he doesn't need to fix himself because that's what I've tried to do my entire life. So that's what I would tell him.
just got goosebumps. What a better way to end the conversation like this with goosebumps. Brother, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, my
Thank you
friend.
for being in my life as well. And I'm looking forward to talk soon.
I appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much.
Ich freue mich, dass du bis zum Schluss dabei warst. Wenn dich diese Folge berührt hat, nimm dir vielleicht einen Moment Zeit, um nachzuspüren. Was bewegt sich gerade in dir? Was fragt nach deiner Aufmerksamkeit? Was willst du dir selbst ehrlicher eingestehen? Schau mal für dich, ob und wenn ja, welche Antworten da in dir auftauchen. Weil oft ist es ja so, man hört etwas Interessantes, etwas, das einen berührt und dann verfliegt es, aber es verflüchtigt sich sehr schnell wieder, weil man gleich wieder zum nächsten übergeht und dann hört man schon wieder den nächsten Podcast und liest das nächste Buch. Aber wenn hier wertvolle Erkenntnisse für dich dabei waren, Insights, die du dir gerne in den Alltag mitnehmen möchtest, dann nimm dir vielleicht ein Notizbuch zur Hand, schreib dir ein paar Dinge auf. Ja? Nutz diese Gelegenheit und lass mich mega gern wissen, was du dir notierst, was du dir mitnimmst aus der Folge, was du gerne in deinen Alltag integrieren möchtest. Wie immer auf Instagram, auf jakob.horvath, unter dem Post zur Folge oder per Mail an mail@jakob.horvath.com. Mehr Infos und Links zu Alex Lehmann und seiner großartigen Arbeit findest du ebenfalls in den Shownotes. Gehst du mit den besprochenen Themen in Resonanz? Hat dir die Folge gefallen? Dann teile den Podcast doch mit Freunden und Bekannten oder vielleicht magst du ihn auch als Story auf Instagram teilen oder in einer anderen Plattform. Tag mich da sehr, sehr gerne unter jakob.horvath. Lass uns wissen, was du dir aus dem Gespräch mitnimmst und wenn du unsere Arbeit hier besonders wertschätzen magst, dann freuen wir uns über eine 5-Sterne-Rezension auf deiner Lieblings-Podcast-Plattform. Es kostet nur 2 Minuten plus minus und bewirkt sehr, sehr Großes. Weil erstens freue ich mich immer riesig darüber, dort zu lesen, warum ihr den Podcast gerne hört. Zweitens hilft es Menschen dabei, sich für den Podcast zu entscheiden und ihm eine Chance zu geben, wenn dort mehr positive Rezensionen stehen. Klar. Und drittens sorgt es dafür, dass mehr Menschen den Podcast hören, der Impact größer wird und ich mehr interessante Interviewgäste für euch einladen kann. Danke also von Herzen an alle von euch, die da schon eine Rezension geschrieben haben. Ich weiß das wirklich sehr, sehr zu schätzen. Danke, dass es dich gibt. Schön, dass du da bist. Auf das Leben, dein Jakob.